In 1929, over a decade after Allied triumph in World War I, the United States Congress authorized funding for pilgrimages to transport over 6,000 mothers of fallen soldiers overseas to visit their sons' graves and grieve their tragic losses. While the Gold Star Mother pilgrimages successfully added to the patriotic mood needed to support American war efforts, it also evoked controversy concerning its lavish amenities and cost during the hardships of the Great Depression and the inclusion of African American mothers from a racially divided society.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy.
With the rise of political tensions in Europe that brought the start of World War I in 1914, America prepared for the possibility of war by mobilizing troops throughout the country. When the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted in 1917, America relinquished its neutral position and entered the war. However, the United States was not as well equipped for battle as its European allies due to a shortage of trained military personnel. In order to meet the demand for soldiers needed in Europe, Woodrow Wilson signed into law the Selective Service Act of 1917, requiring all men in the United States between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the draft. Many Americans protested U.S. involvement in the war, including wives and mothers of those drafted to serve. Even though women didn't earn the right to vote until 1920 after the war's end, anti-war groups, such as the Women's Peace Party led by prominent female activists of the time period, shifted the political climate through their activism. In response, the U.S. War Department used propaganda to garner support for the war. This campaign was aimed at women who opposed the war, especially mothers, and promoted the message that being a good mother meant raising their boys to fight for America. A key part of the government's plan to build patriotic support for the war effort involved encouraging families to display a Blue Star banner on their home's window, one star for every member serving in the armed services. For those who died overseas, President Woodrow Wilson suggested families change the blue stars to gold stars to signify their loss, hence coining the phrase Gold Star Mothers. Since tradition regarding death dictated pulling shades and wearing dark attire, the gold stars were designed to positively reframe the situation by placing the emphasis on the family's triumphant sacrifice for the greater good rather than on their tragic personal loss. Thus, the gold stars became a badge of honor and unified mothers all over the country. On November 11, 1918, the year-long infusion of American troops and resources into the Western Front finally tipped the scale in the Allies' favor, prompting Germany to sign an armistice, ending the war. However, the triumphant Allied victory was tempered by the tragic loss of 116,000 American lives. Although the War Department promised to return the war dead to America, transportation and funding issues interfered with the process. Although families of the fallen were later given the choice to have their loved ones' remains sent home, over 30,000 opted to have them buried in Europe. While American cemeteries in Europe were being built immediately following World War I, mothers of fallen soldiers formed organizations including the Gold Star Mothers Incorporated, led by Grace Darling Siebold, which grew quickly and gained national attention. United by their shared tragedy, Gold Star Mothers began lobbying Congress for a federally sponsored pilgrimage to visit their sons' graves. However, due to conflict over who would be eligible to go on the voyages and the estimated $5 million in travel expenses, the bill stalled.
I saw a letter where a woman said, why don't you spend this money on the veterans who came back, the living, who are having a hard time adjusting, World War I put holes in a lot of bodies, holes in a lot of lives, spend it on rehabilitating the wounded vets. And it's the kind of issue we face even today. What are the obligations of the government, the people who offer, their not just their lives, but sometimes their limbs, their vision, their sanity, in defense of a national ideal.
After its reintroduction to Congress several times and gaining a critical endorsement from the American Legion, the bill was triumphantly signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge on March 2, 1929, authorizing Gold Star mothers and widows who had not remarried to travel to American cemeteries in Europe. Because eligible pilgrims represented the racial diversity of the American Army during the World War, newly elected President Herbert Hoover promised, "No discrimination whatever will be made as between the various groups. Each group will receive equal accommodations, care, and consideration." However, consistent with the Jim Crow era segregation of the military at the time, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps decided to segregate the pilgrimages, a decision that created much controversy.
One feature of the pilgrimages is that they were segregated by color, that the government decided that it would send the wives of African American fallen to Europe. Wives were mothers, but it also specified that they would be segregated.
The NAACP protested the trip, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois told African American mothers and widows to boycott the pilgrimage, stating, "Black hands buried the putrid bodies of white American soldiers in France, yet black mothers cannot go with white mothers to look at their graves."
There are some people in the black community who are very unhappy at that. Some black women were encouraged not to go because it was going to be a segregated trip for them.
While many objected, 168 African American women still participated in the pilgrimages, traveling in second-class vessels to Europe, while the white mothers enjoyed luxury accommodations. Segregation was not the only point of conflict concerning the pilgrimages. Only months after they were authorized, the stock market crashed, plunging America into economic despair. As a result, struggling Americans protested these trips due to their extravagant cost. Nonetheless, plans for the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages continued. The Quartermaster Corps carefully organized the program and cared for the mothers and widows, organizing every detail of the journey and monitoring the pilgrims' physical and emotional health. Escorted by Army officers and nurses, the pilgrims traveled to many of the major tourist sites in the countries they visited, including the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. They also visited battlefields and memorials in addition to the graves of their loved ones. Even though African American mothers were denied the same amenities as their white counterparts on the journey, upon arriving in Paris, they were introduced to a new viewpoint on race. Free of Jim Crow laws, African American mothers experienced freedoms not available to them in America.
I do think that blacks in Europe had a much more freeing experience because they didn't have to deal with such hatred and bias in the same way. They were probably amazed. Black women being waited on, an unreal reality for these women who probably most worked in service and factories.
In conclusion, American women's success in convincing the U.S. government to sponsor and pay for the entire pilgrimage demonstrated the growing power of women at the national level in the post-World War I era. Overall, 6,654 women participated in the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages from 1930 to 1933, playing a key role in early commemorations at overseas cemeteries. Additionally, these public journeys represented an opportunity to confirm national glory in the war's outcome while simultaneously honoring the participants' sacrifices and easing their grief, a legacy that lives on through the organization that still bears its name.